You're walking through a medieval market square. There's the smell of boiled cabbage, livestock and, oddly, freshly forged iron. You look left, and what do you see? A blacksmith holding up what looks suspiciously like an iron diaper. That, friend, is a chastity belt. Or is... Let's start with this infamous device. The chastity belt is often imagined as a cruel metal contraption, locked around a woman's pelvis to prevent any access, sexual or otherwise, while her husband was away. It's the stuff of Monty Python sketches and high school jokes. But here's the twist. Most historians agree it probably didn't exist in the way we imagine. There are a few belts on display in European museums, sure, but many of those were created in the 19th century. Part curiosity, part Victorian kink fantasy masquerading as history. The medieval world did obsess over fidelity though, especially among the nobility, where lineage and inheritance were sacred. But instead of metal underwear, what actually enforced chastity was surveillance. Servants, family members and religious guilt did more policing than padlocks ever could. Still, the idea of locking up desire wasn't entirely fiction. Some nobles were said to give their wives iron girdles as symbolic gifts. Think of it as the medieval version of "I trust you but just in case." Whether anyone actually wore one long-term, doubtful. Historians still argue whether even a single authentic medieval chastity belt exists. The body needs to urinate, menstruate, clean itself. Design flaws alone make it a logistical nightmare. Now, if you're thinking, okay, but surely the men weren't controlled this way, you're absolutely right. But don't let them off the hook just yet. Enter the cuckold's horns. Public shame was an equal opportunity sport. If a man's wife was suspected of cheating, he might be forced to parade through town with a helmet shaped like horns, an ancient symbol of being a fool in love. Sometimes these headpieces were wildly elaborate, with bells or feathers to draw more attention. Other times just simple antlers strapped on like some grotesque headband. There are records of such public humiliations taking place during festivals or court sentences, and while it sounds cartoonish, the emotional sting was sharp. Being labeled a cuckold meant you'd lost control not just of your marriage, but of your masculine honor. Which in medieval Europe was practically a second soul. It wasn't always formal punishment either. Sometimes it was social theater. Neighbors who thought you were being cheated on might anonymously leave a pair of horns nailed to your door. Basically, medieval trolling. And while we're on strange accessories, let's talk about the scold's bridle. Not sexual per se, but adjacent. This iron muzzle was clamped onto the heads of women accused of gossiping, nagging, or unfeminine behavior. Which, let's be honest, often meant speaking her mind. It had a plate that pushed into the tongue, making speech painful. Again, the line between controlling behavior and punishing sexuality was often blurred. Because to many in medieval society, a woman who spoke too freely might also act too freely. So here you are imagining life in this twisted theater of repression and punishment. There's a public square, a bridle on one woman, horns on one man, and somewhere in the shadows perhaps, a chastity belt hanging on a hook like a warning. Of course, not everyone believed in literal metal restraint. Medieval medical texts offered their own approach to suppressing female desire. One recipe involved rubbing crushed lettuce and goose fat onto the genitals, yes, seriously, supposedly to cool the body's hot humors, which were believed to drive lust. Quirky? Definitely. Effective? Let's just say medieval science had its moments. But perhaps the most disturbing thing here isn't the hardware or the home remedies, it's the belief system beneath it all, the assumption that sexuality, especially feminine sexuality, was dangerous, chaotic, and in need of control. And that control was often enforced, not just through law or theology, but through spectacle. The humiliation itself became part of the punishment. You imagine yourself living in that world, your body constantly under scrutiny, your marriage a public matter, your pleasure a whispered sin, and just maybe, you're grateful for your warm, soft bed and the absence of iron accessories tonight. You wake up on crisp linen in a dimly lit room, and before you even stretch your legs, someone's at the foot of your bed, watching, not in the Netflix and chill kind of way, in the we're all here to confirm you consummated your marriage kind of way. Welcome to your medieval wedding night. It sounds absurd, but in many parts of medieval Europe, especially among nobility and royalty, proving the virginity of a bride and the validity of the marriage bed was a full-on community affair. And I do mean community. Let's start with the infamous virginity test. The idea was simple, if fundamentally flawed. If a woman was a virgin, she would bleed during her first act of intercourse. And if she didn't, well, clearly she was impure, dishonest, maybe even cursed. Historians today know this is junk science. Hemons vary wildly, and bleeding isn't guaranteed. But in the medieval mindset, the body was treated like a ledger of moral truth. No blood meant no honor, and so it had to be demonstrated. In many cases, sheets were inspected the next morning for blood stains. Clean sheets might spark scandal. In France and some Germanic regions, the stained linen might even be paraded through the village as proud evidence. Talk about airing your dirty laundry, literally. And if you were unlucky enough to be part of the royal court, oh, things got weirder. It wasn't unheard of for witnesses, often elderly women, midwives or clergy, to be present in the room as the couple consummated their marriage. Usually they stood politely behind curtains or turned their backs, the medieval version of privacy, but the expectation was that they would hear the act take place. You think you've had awkward honeymoons? Imagine trying to get it done while someone scribbles notes in the corner. The reasoning behind all this was legal, as much as it was sexual. A marriage wasn't considered fully binding unless consummated. So if an alliance fell apart, the presence or absence of intercourse could mean war, annulment, or dynastic collapse. Monarchs didn't just marry for love, they married for treaties, for land, for power, no pressure. And the scrutiny didn't end with your wedding night. If a couple couldn't conceive, people rarely blamed the man. No, the woman was usually the culprit. Medical texts suggested odd solutions, from warm wine soaks to fumigating the uterus with herbs. Yep, vaginal incense was a thing, and if none of that worked, there were trials. In some parts of Europe, women were subjected to a kind of bedroom interrogation. A classic example, the trial by touch, where a midwife might examine a woman's body to determine whether she had ever been properly known by her husband. Again, junk science wrapped in humiliation. But not all marital sex was doom and gloom. Sometimes it was strangely theatre. In medieval Spain, among the peasantry, there are scattered reports of bride and groom being tucked into bed by the village, while relatives sang cheeky songs or made loud jokes from outside the chamber. It was all part of making sure the couple started their marriage on the right foot, whatever that meant. Still, beneath the laughter was anxiety, because virginity wasn't just a state of being, it was currency, and if it was spent too early, there was often no going back. One fringe but fascinating tidbit: in late medieval Italy, some women were rumored to fake virginity using sponges soaked in animal blood, carefully inserted before the wedding night. Others used herbal tonics to tighten the vaginal muscles. Were these effective? Probably not, but desperate times. And of course there were religious ramifications. The church tolerated sex, but only for procreation, and preferably without too much pleasure. Certain positions were frowned upon, especially if they seemed to prioritize female pleasure. Missionary was fine, hence the name supposedly, but anything more creative, risky business. One theologian even warned that face-to-face kissing during intercourse could infect the soul with unnatural heat. That's one way to ruin the mood. So here you are again, lying on your straw-filled mattress, with your new spouse beside you, and half the village holding its breath outside your window. Every creak of the bed frame is a performance. Every sigh is evidence. No pressure. You close your eyes, imagining the hush of the castle corridor, the muffled laughter of your cousins outside, the pressure of centuries of expectations weighing down your chest like a velvet mantle. And somewhere nearby, a midwife folds a sheet, her eyes searching for spots of red. You drift down a stone hallway, the cold flagstones echoing under your feet. Candles flicker in alcoves, casting halos of gold across smooth pillars. The air smells faintly of beeswax, parchment and incense. You've arrived at a medieval monastery. You think peace, prayer, maybe Gregorian chants. But step closer, and you'll find a world more complicated and surprisingly frisky than your childhood Bible coloring books ever prepared you for. Let's start with the basics. Monks and nuns, by vow, were supposed to be celibate, but, and this is a very big but, human nature doesn't just vanish behind stone walls and Latin chants, especially when the alternative to marriage was lifelong isolation. poor hygiene and theological debates about whether cats had souls. Many took their vows seriously, of course, but others strayed. And while medieval church records often speak in dry euphemisms like lapsed chastity or improper familiarity, what they're really describing is sex, affairs and full-blown love triangles behind the cloistered veil. Take the case of Sister Agnes of Prague, accused of fleshly behavior with not one but two visiting priests, or Brother Thomas, exiled from his abbey after being caught sneaking into the nunnery next door with a wheel of cheese as a gift. It seems flirting via dairy products was the medieval equivalent of texting you up. Historians still argue whether these affairs were widespread or exceptional, but the sheer number of ecclesiastical court cases suggests the cloister wasn't always so pure, and while punishment varied, repeat offenders could be flogged, excommunicated or even imprisoned in their own cells, ironically given more alone time to reflect on their sins, unless that's what got them in trouble in the first place. But the naughtiest insights don't come from trial records, they come from the books, specifically the marginalia, those quirky little doodles and drawings crammed into the margins of illuminated manuscripts. You know, the stuff monks drew when they were supposed to be copying psalms. Now before we go on, please prepare yourself for what might be the strangest image of the evening. A fully armored snail battling a naked man with an erection the size of his own torso. Yes, that's in a 14th century psalter, probably drawn by a monk, and it's not even the weirdest one. There are illustrations of monkeys performing obscene acts, disembodied phalluses flying through the air like arrows, and priests caught in compromising positions with nuns, sometimes depicted with animal heads, just to drive the metaphor home. The margins of sacred texts became a strange kind of vent, absurd, naughty, sometimes outright hilarious, and these weren't rogue scribes having a laugh. Some of these images were part of well-funded elite manuscript commission. Which raises a fun question: were the noble patrons in on the joke? One standout gem in the margins of the Romance of the Rose. There's a drawing of a nun harvesting penises from a tree with a sickle, placing them carefully into a basket. Some scholars interpret this as a satire of repressed sexuality, others say it was just good old-fashioned bawdy humor, the medieval version of a dirty meme. Either way, it tells us something important. Despite strict rules and heavy theology, medieval minds were vividly alive with fantasy, contradiction, and irreverence. The body might be declared sinful, but it never stopped being funny. Even medical texts joined the party. In one 12th century treatise on women's health, a monk physician included detailed diagrams of female anatomy, one resembling a smiling face, complete with cheerful captions. Educational? Maybe. Artistic freedom? Likely. A touch of sublimated desire? Almost certainly. And yet, amid all this cheeky play, genuine affection sometimes blossomed. There are recorded love letters between monks and nuns, full of longing and metaphor, describing love as a form of divine suffering. It's hard not to read them as deeply human, people craving touch, affection, understanding, all while cloaked in wool robes and surrounded by reminders of eternal damnation, which is beautiful, and also a theological nightmare. No wonder the abbot confiscated the parchment. And speaking of rules, you'd think the church would stamp all this out immediately. But not always. Some abbots turned a blind eye if the scandal wasn't too public. Others worried more about political alliances than moral purity. And in certain periods monastic corruption was so rampant that brothels operated shockingly close to the cloister gates, some reportedly staffed by former nuns. Of course, not all monasteries were dens of disobedience. Many were centers of discipline and deep spirituality. But the point remains, sexuality didn't vanish behind high walls. It simply changed shape, moved into margins, disguised itself in metaphors and sometimes leapt out in full-color miniatures with horses and improbable vegetables. You lie there now picturing a quiet chapel lit by flickering tapers. But in the scriptorium next door, a bored monk is giggling as he draws yet another lascivious rabbit in the corner of a holy manuscript. Somewhere nearby, a nun writes a poem about longing, carefully hiding it beneath her mattress, and overhead the bell rings out for midnight prayer, summoning bodies full of longing back to divine order. You're sitting beside a smoky hearth now, listening to an old woman grind herbs with a stone pestle. She whispers things she's not supposed to know, things about lust, fertility, curses, and charms. This isn't the monastery anymore. This is the folk world of medieval Europe, where Christian doctrine coexists awkwardly with ancient pagan belief, and sex. Sex is both medicine and sin, miracle and danger. Let's talk about sin charts first. Yes, those were real. Medieval penitentials, handbooks for confessors, often included detailed lists of sexual acts, ranked by how grievous they were in the eyes of God. Missionary, within marriage for the purpose of procreation, barely a ding on your moral report card, but anything that hinted at pleasure for pleasure's sake. Now we're talking eternal damnation. One chart from the 13th century lists over 30 specific bedroom sins, including positions, timing, sex during Lent, naughty, and even locations. If it wasn't in the marital bed, it was suspect. Some acts earned you a week of bread and water, others required years of penance, public flogging, or worse. So yes, technically getting frisky on a haystack could cost you your soul. But while the church tried to categorize and control sexuality, the common folk turned to more creative sources for understanding desire. Folk medicine and superstition blended sex with the natural world in ways that feel bizarre today. Want to increase fertility? Some recipes advised women to drink a potion made from crushed rabbit testicles and honey. Struggling with impotence, one cure involved roasting wolf penis over oak wood, grinding it into powder, and mixing it with wine. That's not a punchline, that's medieval pharmacology. One particularly strange belief held that wearing the testicle of a weasel around the neck could prevent conception, not eating it, just wearing it. Fashion meets birth control, 14th century style. Then there were aphrodisiacs, often based more on animal behavior than human science. Oysters, onions and sparrow brains all made appearances in bedroom enhancement recipes. One Italian manual even recommended crocodile dung as a contraceptive, inserted as a sort of medieval diaphragm, because when you think romance you think reptile. Historians still argue whether these methods were taken seriously or were more symbolic, part of a ritual rather than expected to produce results. But what's clear is that medieval people were obsessed with controlling sexuality, whether through God, through charms, or through goat liver smoothies. And if the idea of sex as medicine seems weird, remember lust wasn't just a feeling, it was a symptom. Medieval doctors, trained in humoral theory, believed that too much sexual desire was a sign of bodily imbalance. Women in particular were seen as dangerously moist and warm, a combination that apparently led to uncontrollable urges. One French physician warned that if a woman went too long without sex, her uterus might literally wander the body and cause madness. Yes, the wandering womb was not just a metaphor. The cure, sometimes it involved marriage, other times, herbs, steam baths, or manual intervention. Yes, midwives occasionally treated so-called hysteria with therapeutic massages. We won't go into that detail here, but it's worth noting that what we now understand as sexual frustration was once treated as a physical disorder. And then there were demons. According to church doctrine, lust opened the door to supernatural danger. The devil was said to prowl especially around beds at night, whispering impure thoughts, causing erotic dreams, and sometimes taking physical form. Enter incubi and succubi, demons who seduced humans in their sleep. People genuinely believed they could be sexually assaulted by spirits. Entire treatises were written on how to prevent it. Prayer, holy relics, sleeping in a cross-shaped posture. In some cases, victims were even taken seriously by the church. If someone claimed a demon visited them nightly, they might be assigned a priest for protection, or more grimly, be accused of consorting with evil. But not all supernatural sex was demonic. Folklore across Europe includes tales of fairies, forest spirits, and enchanted lovers, stories where a beautiful stranger appears, shares a night of passion, then vanishes with the dawn, leaving behind only a child or a curse. These tales weren't just entertainment, they reflected deeper anxieties about seduction, desire, and the boundaries between the sacred and the wild. Even the stars played a role. Astrology was commonly used to determine safe days for sex or conception. If Venus was in retrograde, better keep your breeches on. One popular calendar warned couples not to make love on Tuesdays. Apparently Mars made those nights especially violent. So you sit there now listening to the old woman by the fire, as she warns you not to kiss under a hawthorn tree, and certainly not to sleep facing east during a full moon. Not unless you want to conceive a child with wolfish tendencies. Medieval logic? Not exactly, but meaningful to the people who lived by it. What's fascinating is how many of these beliefs coexisted with deep Christian piety. A woman might confess her sins at church in the morning, then visit a wise woman in the woods that afternoon for a love charm. The world was porous, heaven, hell, and hormones all seeping into each other like candle wax on warm parchment. The smells come back to you now: dried sage, goat tallow, something vaguely metallic. Maybe it's that wolf powder. You wonder how many couples over the centuries believed just a little more garlic or thyme would bring love, or stop it cold. And in this strange twilight of faith and folklore, sex becomes more than taboo. It becomes sacred, dangerous, magical, and endlessly, helplessly human. You're standing in the middle of a village square, and something's off. It's not market day, and yet the crowd has gathered. There's a woman on a cart, her hands tied, her face painted garishly, and a sign around her neck. She's being paraded through the streets, and everyone is laughing, jeering, watching. Her crime? Sexual misconduct. Or maybe just being a bit too loud, too bold, too visible. This is where medieval sexuality turns outward, no longer private sin but public spectacle, because when the church didn't control your body, the community often did. Let's talk about public shaming rituals, especially for women accused of adultery or promiscuity. In some towns, an unfaithful wife might be forced to ride backwards on a donkey through the marketplace, wearing only a shift, her hair shaved off as a sign of disgrace. In other cases, she might be marched past her neighbors with a basket of rocks hung around her neck to symbolize the weight of her sins, or perhaps just to make her look ridiculous. Men weren't exempt either. A cuckolded husband might be ridiculed for failing to control his wife, as if her behavior was a direct reflection of his masculinity. One recorded punishment involved dragging a man through town with bells tied to his boots, and a wooden phallus strapped to his back, like some awful Mardi Gras float for the miserably emasculated. And while these punishments seem absurd now, they served a chilling purpose: to remind everyone that sex wasn't private property, it was a communal investment. When someone stepped out of line, the village made sure they paid in humiliation. But sometimes these public acts took a strange, almost celebratory turn. Enter the carnival season, a time when societal rules briefly flipped inside out. Think Mardi Gras, but with more fertility symbols and fewer camera phones. During certain festivals, especially those tied to spring or solstice, sexuality wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. Costumed parades, symbolic marriages, bawdy songs, and ritualized flirting spilled into the streets. In England, for example, May Day celebrations often involved dancing around the maypole. Yes, that's a euphemism, followed by a bit of greenwood frolicking in the forest. This was seen not just as harmless fun, but as a kind of pagan leftover, an echo of ancient fertility rites, barely hidden beneath Christian celebration. Even the church struggled to suppress these traditions. In one particularly desperate letter, a priest in 15th century France begged his bishop to send help because the locals refused to stop singing obscene verses during Easter Mass. They insisted it brought better crop. And if you were thinking surely this was only for peasants, think again. Nobles threw masked balls called charivaris, where participants danced in disguise, swapped identities, and whispered things they'd never dare say in daylight. Some were innocent, others ended in scandal. One infamous charivari ended with the groom's cousin disappearing into the garden with the bride. Whether it was a prank or a proposal, no one was quite sure. But for all its festive surface, the line between celebration and punishment was always thin. Sometimes charivaris were used against couples, especially mismatched ones. If an older man married a much younger woman or vice versa, the community might bang pots outside their home for nights on end, mocking them with songs and skits. A reminder, you may think your bed is yours, but everyone else has an opinion on who's in it. Even execution could be a performance. In some German towns, women accused of prostitution or adultery were drowned in barrels or burned outside city gates, publicly, ritually, often after being paraded through the streets one last time. And yet, those same cities often taxed and regulated brothels, even providing licenses to sex workers. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on the people. There are satirical poems from the time mocking judges who punished fornication by day and visited mistresses by night. One German verse describes a bishop who preached against vice with his lover hiding behind the pulpit. Historians still argue whether these contradictions were conscious or simply cultural blind spots, but either way the result was the same. Sex was everywhere and nowhere, sacred and profane, adored and despised, often at the same time. And through it all, the body was a canvas. Laws dictated who could wear what, depending on their sexual history. In parts of Italy, prostitutes were required to wear yellow veils. In Florence, adulterers might be forced to shave their eyebrows. Fashion became punishment, silk as privilege, linen as shame. But it wasn't always grim. Some women found ways to weaponize their sexuality, manipulating suitors, striking advantageous marriages, or forming informal networks of mutual support. Brothel madams could become powerful figures, offering protection, financial autonomy, even political influence. A few even sponsored churches. Sex in the medieval world could be a source of ruin or survival, and now you're here, standing in the crowd, watching another public ritual unfold. A maypole twisting under the hands of children, a masked dancer blowing a kiss to no one in particular, a disgraced couple led through the square while everyone sings a song about loyalty and goats. You feel the tension, laughter and cruelty, freedom and fear, all braided together like garlands on a festival pole. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of rosemary and sweat, flowers and the sun dips low behind the church tower, casting long shadows over the cobblestones. The show is over. The square begins to empty, and now it's just you and the quiet knowledge that even the strangest rituals had meaning. They were tools, stories, warning. They stitched the social fabric together, thread by thread, whether through desire or disgrace.